Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to our December discussion session for How to Heal Our Divides, compiled by Brian Elaine and Adam Thomas. Our series takes place at noon Eastern on the first Thursday of every month. And today our moderator is Lori Erickson, who will be speaking with Amy Julia Becker. I'm Bethany Baker Henderson, the coordinator for the discussion series, and today we'll be speaking out of chapter 22 in the book, How to Heal Our Divides. And just know that we do have another volume, How to Heal Our Divides, An Abundance of Opportunities. And we'll be going into that book in January. Today, any audience members can put your questions in the chat. And I'd just like to introduce you to Lori Erickson. Lori is one of America's top travel writers specializing in spiritual journeys. She's the author of The Soul of the Family Tree, Near the Exit, and Holy Rover. And her articles and essays have appeared in publications such as the Los Angeles Times, National Geographic Traveler, Better Homes and Gardens, Travel and Leisure, and USA Today. She's also the creator of the spiritual website, Spiritual Travels, and it features spiritual sites around the world. Lori lives in Iowa City, Iowa, with her husband, Bob Sessions, who frequently serves as a photographer on assignments, and Bob is on Instagram at bob.sessions. She's the mother also of 2 adult sons. Lori received her BA in English from Luther College and her MA in English from the University of Iowa. Her work has taken her to dozens of countries around the world. She's the member of the Society of American Travel Writers and the Midwest Travel Journalists Association. Lori has led workshops and given presentations on topics relating to writing, travel, and spirituality. And if you'd like to have her speak with your group, you can contact her on her website. In 2011, Lori was honored with a bronze marker in her hometown of Iowa City, Iowa. The marker is part of the city's literary walk, which features a variety of installations recognizing authors who've lived and worked in the community. The walk was installed after Iowa City was named by UNESCO as the world's 3rd city of literature in 2008. Welcome, Lori. So good to see you. Nice to meet you today.
Thank you so much, Beth. I'm a little embarrassed by that long introduction. I didn't expect you to take all of that from my website, self-promotion and all of that. But anyway, I'm just delighted to be here. And thank you, Brian, too, for thinking of me for a moderator for your discussion series. I'm delighted to introduce Amy Julia Becker. I have admired her work and have followed it from afar. Amy Julia is an award-winning writer and speaker on personal, spiritual, and social healing. She is the author of 4 books, including To Be Made Well, An Invitation to Wholeness, Healing, and Hope. And she also hosts a podcast called Love is Stronger Than Fear. She's a graduate of Princeton University and Princeton Theological Seminary, and she holds a bivocational license with the Evangelical Covenant Church. She lives with her husband and their 3 children in Western Connecticut. So thank you, Amy Julia, for talking with us today. So the chapter that you contributed to the book is called Head, Heart, Hands, a holistic response to the harms of social divisions. So I'm hoping we could begin by having you summarize what you say in that chapter.
Sure. Thank you. And I'll just say thank you for having me. It's great to be here with all of you. And I'm excited just for this whole project and the fact that there is a volume 2 and that subtitle of that one, just that sense of, yes, abundant opportunities. Off we go. But yeah, so for my chapter, because of the space, constraints for one chapter, I really was focused on the hands part of Head, Heart, Hands in terms of what are the small steps that we as individuals who are making individual choices, who have spheres of influence, and who participate in institutions. So those are kind of 3 areas: individual, influential, institutional, where we can take small steps to use what I'm calling our hands, like to take action in the world. there's more that I can say that's not in this chapter, but that goes into that idea of using your head and your heart as a part of a response to injustice, to exclusion, to all of our social divisions. But the chapter here that I'm really writing about, what I'm really writing about is how do we look at our own lives in our own realities, and in the reality of that most people are not going to look at divisions and injustice in our world and take dramatic immediate action. Most of us are going to continue to pay our bills and drive our kids around and, worry because the dishwasher broke, and hopefully be paying attention to the news and to our communities and want to be engaged. And so what are small but meaningful steps we can take that participate in an ongoing work of social healing that affects our lives and our communities? And I believe that can begin with very small individual changes. I write about the ways in which I changed the books that we were reading out loud to our kids, the way I changed the way we talked about news events. And again, for anyone who's listening to this and not seeing this visually, I am a white woman who lives in a predominantly white town where it can seem as though some of the issues related to social divisions and injustice in our society are kind of far away. And I have the privilege of being able to avoid those conversations if I choose to with my children. And yet one of the things that some of my Black friends and other friends of color have really impressed upon me is how important it is to be a part of these conversations and a part of the transformation that our country needs so that we all can be moving towards healing. So again, changing the way I talk with my kids about race and justice, about news events, those are all individual choices. Then on that influential side, looking at what are the circles that I'm a part of, whether that's a neighborhood party or a school or a church, and where might I have influence over the decisions that are made outside of my own home. So for example, this is an example I give in that chapter, I had the role of choosing Sunday school curriculum at our church. And so how could I use my influence there? And we ended up selecting a curriculum called Justice Journey in order, again, for all the kids in our very little, but nevertheless bigger than my family church to engage with some of these questions, in that case, from the perspective of their faith tradition. And then the third aspect of using our hands to make change in the world that I write about is institutions. And that's where we really can't, as individuals, I don't believe, change institutions. But when individuals are connected to one another, we can make institutional change. We can look for ways in which institutions, the systems and the structures of our political systems, our school systems, our legal systems, our criminal justice systems, all of those things, as individuals who band together, we can, in a variety of different ways, look and work towards institutional change. So that's a not too brief summary of what I had to say in that chapter.
It makes me think of the wonderful resource that you also have linked to on your website. I'm wondering if you could tell people a little bit about that, because that really expands upon what you included in your chapter.
Yeah, exactly. So when I wrote a book in 2018 called White Picket Fences, and it's really a memoir. So it's a story of my own journey to recognize myself as a person of what we often call privilege, where I have what I call unearned social advantages, things that I was born into. I didn't ask for them, but I also didn't deserve them. I didn't work hard for them, which doesn't mean I didn't work hard in my life. It just didn't work hard to be the person I was born, the family I was born into, and all those things. And so coming to recognize that I had advantages other people did not for no particular reason, and that allowed me to participate in social divisions and various forms of injustice that I didn't even maybe want to or sign up for, but that was the reality. What was I going to do about that? And particularly as a Christian, was there a way to acknowledge and really pay attention to that reality while also responding with hope and healing? I saw a lot of anger, a lot of despair, a lot of cynicism around some of these issues, and I wondered if there was another way. So that's what that book is about. But it's really a story of my life as a mother of a child with Down syndrome, who again is kind of inside and outside this world of privilege, story of a white person in America in the 21st century. And then after I wrote the book, I was speaking really all around the country because so many of us were asking similar questions, and people just kept saying, okay, but what do I do? But what do I do? But what do I do? And I had resisted that question when I was writing the book for a variety of reasons. But as a result of the conversations that occurred after the book, I came up with just a free resource on my website called Head, Heart, Hands, because that was the process that I saw myself going through to really ask, okay, in my head, like in my thinking self, what do I need to understand? What do I need to understand differently than I have before? What might I need to do some research on? When I read a news story and, for example, think because of my experiences with police officers, I tend to think of police officers as protectors and keepers of our institutional spaces, whereas my friend who is raising a brown-skinned boy in a town nearby is like, yeah, I tend to be afraid for him in encounters with police officers. So what do I need to understand about the history of policing in our nation? What do I need to understand about my own perspective? How can I use my head to really understand history and understand our current contemporary moment and just ask questions of myself and of others? But then also, how can I use my heart? How can I connect with my heart? So emotionally, spiritually, personally, with other individuals, with their stories. So that can happen in person, but it also can happen through books and through movies and through connecting with stories. And what spiritual resources can I call upon in order to be confronting some hard stories and confronting some hard realities about myself and about our nation? And that then moves to the hands, right? You've got this kind of information, this experience and relationships, and then action. And it doesn't have to be necessarily in that order, but I do think we need all of those things in order to really be set up to participate for the long haul in an act of justice and healing, rather than to burn out or to become cynical or to become despairing or detached from the real people who are affected by these injustices. So Head, Heart, Hands is really, it's a free resource attending to give people ways to ask questions and move through a process of thinking and feeling and doing when it comes to some of these issues.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned stories as part of your discovery process, and I'm wondering if you could share a story or two that really moved you, affected you, subsequent to writing the chapter, and also the resource guide that you did.
You know, I can actually there's so many stories, and one that I'm thinking about came up with my daughter today. So I have now an 11-year-old daughter. And one of the things I was rereading my chapter just before we were talking, and I noticed that I wrote about a conversation she and I had when she was 9. So 2 years ago, after George Floyd was killed, she wanted to learn about that, which again was a couple of years earlier, even with my 9-year-old son, might not have told him about George Floyd's murder, but I had changed my perspective on how to talk to our kids about this. But I still wanted to be age appropriate, and she wanted to see the video of George Floyd's death. And I said, no, I'm not going to show you that, but I am going to show you I'll show you a photo of it, but I'm also going to show you photos of George Floyd as a dad, as a man, and not simply as a victim of brutality, because I want you to understand the wholeness of his life. So we did that together. And then this morning, she for school is reading a book called All American Boys. And in All American Boys, there is an interaction. There's a brown-skinned kid. I'm not sure of his ethnicity. He's not African American, but who is seems to be shoplifting according to a video surveillance camera. That's not what's happening. And he then gets beaten up by a white police officer. And a white boy sees this happening. So you're kind of inside the head of a white teenager trying to figure out, what did I just see and how do I reconcile this? And my daughter is reading it. So on the way to school today, we're talking about it, and she mentioned George Floyd. And she said, I feel like something like that is what happened with George Floyd. And she said, I think it's just about racism. And I said, well, what do you even mean by that? So we went into just this long conversation that on some level was simply about a ride to school this morning and a book she's reading for school. But it's also about these years of her familiarity with George Floyd's death, with some of the issues that are going on in our society. And then one of the things that came up, I said, well, who else in school is reading this book? And she said, well, Naomi is. And Naomi is a Black student in her class. And I said, Marilee, you don't need to be afraid to talk with Naomi about the fact that you are white and she is Black, and you might have different experiences talking about this book. And she was like, Mom, that would be kind of awkward. And I said, well, you know what, sweetie? You have a sister with Down syndrome. So I just want you to imagine someone in your class reading a book about someone with Down syndrome. Would you think it was awkward if they brought up that you have a sister with Down syndrome? She's like, no, not at all. And I thought, well, right. Like, a part of your identity is having a sister with Down syndrome. A part of Naomi's identity is being Black. It's just a part of her identity. And I don't mean you need to push and ask her to have all sorts of, feelings or put those feelings on her, but she has brothers who are Black and you have a brother who's white, and you might read this book differently as a result of that when you think about your teenage brothers out in the world, and you could bring that up with her if you wanted to. So that's, again, a long way of answering your question, just to say that this encounter with my daughter just this morning has been shaped and formed by these little moments over the course of a couple of years. And again, one which is referenced in this chapter, and then other things that have happened since then. But my growing comfort and actually commitment to actually bringing these issues and topics into our family and normalizing some of those hard issues and saying, yeah, this is a part of family life. It's a part of community life. It's a part of our national life. That's been really important for us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. A very thoughtful response. So shifting gears just a little bit, one of the concepts that always fascinates me is the idea of call. And I think that call, people who write about spiritual matters as we do, there is in a sense, call is we have a call both to a spiritual path and a call to writing. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you view those calls, if you put it in those terms, and how it informs the writing that you have done and the writing that you are doing now and hope to do in the future.
Yeah, I think calling is a really interesting question. And there is a sense of not just a calling, yes, to spiritual path and yes to writing, but also, at least for me, and I think this is true for lots of people, to particular audience. And so for me, over time, I think I've realized that my calling is to an audience of people who have had similar life stories to my own, which is to say people who have experienced the privileges of being born white and having had education and relative social stability. And yet, because I'm able to bring in the experience of having a child with a disability and some of the questions and experiences and opportunities that's opened up for me, that has changed the way I've been able to address people who are very similar to me and yet haven't had those same experiences. The first book I wrote was called A Good and Perfect Gift, and it's a spiritual memoir about having a child with Down syndrome. And although it has been most widely read by other parents of children with Down syndrome who are looking for, a way to understand their own experience, I really wrote it for people who didn't get the beautiful gift of a child with Down syndrome, because I knew that for me, I needed so much of what I have been given through having Penny in my life. And I wanted to say, hey, other overachieving perfectionists out there, there are things that you can be given through the children in your lives, the other people who you encounter, even if you don't have a baby with Down syndrome. And I think that's true, whether it's in a lot of the writing I'm doing, is just thinking about, yes, I'm sharing a story and I'm called to share a story, but I'm also called to a particular group of people and to try to translate my experience in a way that might invite them also into the love of God, into an exploration of what it means to be human, and all of these things I've learned. So yeah, I could say more about calling, but that's what comes to mind when you first asked.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So shifting gears just a little bit again, it seems to me that one of the main issues relating to Brian's book in general, but certainly anyone who writes about issues relating to social justice and healing is the whole idea of not just preaching to the choir, not just preaching to people who are already interested in what you have to say or dealing with these issues. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how to broaden that circle, how to reach out to people, how to, hold hands across walls, which is, certainly a central theme of what the entire book tries to do.
Well, I guess there are a couple of ways. One is that one-on-one. I mean, the way I've heard about people saying, okay, this is a book that I could invite my mother-in-law to read with me, and we haven't been able to talk about these issues, or we've always gotten in a fight about it before, so trying to find, if you are someone who's only, it feels like preaching to the choir, to say, okay, well, where is the person who is actually not in the choir, but where this, what could I find to watch or read or think about together that might be a point of connection that allows some of those conversations? I also think a lot about my husband and I. My husband's in education, and we talk a lot about, sometimes we want people to be at step 10 on a process of learning when they're at step 1. And so we can start at step 10 and they can feel either like they're being, they're in over their head, or they're being talked down to, or they just don't know. Or you can say, yeah, you're at step 1. What's step 2? So I think some of it has to do with changing your posture and assumptions and expectations without being arrogant about it. Because I mean, that can sound really arrogant, well, I'm at step 10 and you're only at step 1. But so with humility, in terms of recognizing, this is actually, sorry, I'm pausing a minute, but one of the things I feel like I've really learned in the past 15 years of having Penny in my life is about relationships as giving and receiving. And it's very easy, especially I think for any of us who have gone on a journey of learning or of healing, to just be in a posture of now I have things to give. And that's true. I mean, you do have things to give, but I think we also always have things to receive. And so trying to see each human we encounter, even someone who it's oh my gosh, my Uncle Harry, who always says the terrible thing, and I've put him in a box of those people who I can't talk to, or who I'm going to have to roll my eyes, or my stomach's going to churn, or whatever. Okay, is there anything I can receive from this man? Is there anything in his humanity that I actually need? And I don't mean, certainly there are some situations where it's just not safe to have a conversation and you need to walk away. But in the ones where that's not what's going on, but disdain is not going to lead to hand holding across walls, right? And that's an easy posture for someone who feels I've been on a journey, I've done the work, you haven't, right? We can get into a posture of disdain rather than humility. I think Shane Claiborne's essay speaks to that in How to Heal Our Divides, which I really appreciated. So I'd kind of recommend that for people who are asking some of these questions, how can we have a posture of confidence and that we have something to offer, but also humility, knowing that we always have something to learn.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And following up along those lines, who do you admire? Who do you listen to? Who have you learned from?
Oh my gosh, I'm sitting in my office right now and I just feel like I could just start reading names of book titles. So I really have learned a lot. I'm grateful also. Let's see, I'm thinking about Jamar Tisby, who wrote a book called The Color of Compromise and another called How to Fight Racism. I've had him on my podcast a few times as well. So we've gotten to know each other. We're really grateful for the work he's done, both on that head, the history specifically around the church in America. And he's done some really great work around white nationalism today that I appreciate. David Bailey is another man who he's a Black man, lives in Richmond, Virginia, and he has a nonprofit called Erebon, which is doing reconciliation work with churches. And I've been very grateful for a friendship and just ongoing conversations with him.
And by the way, David is one of the authors in the first How to Heal Our Divides book also.
That's right. So there, look him up too. He's
because
fantastic.
you introduced me to him.
Right. I do love David. I have some friendships, a couple writer friends, Natasha Robinson, Patricia Raybon, who are Black women who've been real gifts to me. My best friend from high school also is a Sri Lankan American who we've had these conversations now, for kind of 30 years, and I've learned a lot from her. And then again, the list of authors, whether that's going back to, I was an African American studies minor in college, so started reading, anyone from Toni Morrison to going back to some of the narratives of enslaved people. So I feel like I've had a learning through books for a long time. It took a lot longer for that to be learning through relationships for me, where I was actually in relationship with other people and had the boldness to say, can you tell me about your experience and how did this land for you? And, having those conversations. So yeah, I could go on and on, but I'll stop there for now.
Well, it strikes me that you're someone who's very comfortable and skilled, not only at writing, but also in dialogue with people. And so I think that's a natural segue to talking about your podcast. So why did you start it? When did you start it? And what have you learned from it?
Yeah, so I actually started it in March or April of 2020 when the world shut down. At least that's what it felt like in my household because of the pandemic. I had been thinking about having a podcast for years, and I would say I struggle with perfectionism because it can really hold me back from doing something like just starting a podcast. And my husband was like, just try it. We're stuck in our house. Just sit in front of your computer. And in that case, I literally just went through the book of Philippians and talked about it. Like it was almost like I was giving an extemporaneous, sermon for 20 minutes. And I did that over the course of about 10 weeks. And I was kind of like, okay, we'll see if anyone listens, see if anything comes of that. And then when George Floyd was killed that spring, what I had always really wanted to do was a podcast related to my book, White Picket Fences, where I interviewed people. But I hadn't had the confidence to I was like, I don't know how to do it technologically. I don't know how to do it when it comes to, how do you ask people good questions? How much time does it take? Do you edit it? What do you do? So for whatever reason, doing that initial podcast on Philippians gave me the confidence that I could figure it out and that it would be worth doing. And when George Floyd was killed, White Picket Fences, there was a renewed interest in that book because people were really grappling with these issues. And so I started calling on some of my friends. I think Natasha and David were some of the early podcast interviews I did. And, I had like a 2-hour conversation with Natasha, which we had to edit. And I realized, oh gosh, don't do that again. Like it's just too hard to figure it out. So I did definitely learn. I learned some things just, again, about like, how many questions should I prepare and how do I, flow with the conversation and yet also guide and direct the conversation. But I think what I've also learned is just that I love engaging with people and with their ideas and being able to read a book or watch a film or, listen to someone and then ask questions about what they're doing. It's a real blessing to me. It feels like professional development, where I'm just being really spurred on to think about things differently. And I guess I've really learned more about all of the topics that I'm talking to people about and been able to ask questions like, okay, what do I do as, if I'm a white person in rural Connecticut, what do I do when I was talking to David, for example, when the Confederate monuments were being taken down in Richmond, which can seem really distant from me here. So there was a lot of like kind of specific learning, but also learning about just the friendship and connection that can happen through conversation.
Mm-hmm. 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 So what gives you hope? I mean, you write about a lot of complicated and hard topics. So what are your sources of hope in writing about these things and thinking about them personally?
A long time ago, I was asked to give a talk on hope in Richmond, Virginia. We lived there for a while, so I've got some connections down there. And I remember saying at the time that the spiritual imagination is a vehicle for hope. Just that this sense of hope is both like being real in the present moment, but also kind of casting a net towards the future, the promised future. And I believe that is true. So I do believe that looking at the promises that we have, that there will be an end to suffering and to pain, and we get, and it's like hope is like pulling that future into the present moment. It's not just looking for that, it's pulling it forward. So having stories that actually do speak to connection and beauty and joy and goodness, but also this has been a little bit not complicated, but I guess enhanced for me recently. I was reading an interview between Mike Cosper at Christianity Today and Bono after Bono's new book came out. And they were talking about how lament is a form of hope. Lament is different than despair. Despair is naming what is wrong and unjust and terrible about the world without any hope that it will change. Whereas lament is saying it is not supposed to be this way. And the reason I'm bringing that up in God's presence is because God is supposed to do something about that. And yes, I am also supposed to do something about that as a part of God's community. But that was really helpful to me, that like lament is a form of hope. And I think especially as we look to some of the things that otherwise would lead us to despair or to rage, which I do think are hopeless postures. But I think like righteous anger and lament can actually be forms of hope, because we are saying this is not how it's supposed to be. And yet we can look to how it is supposed to be. We can pull that into this present moment through these little signposts of hope, right? Little moments that are pointing us towards that promised future. So I do find hope in small connections, in stories like, this is a story I heard Brian Stevenson, who is the founder of the EJI, Equal Justice Initiative. He was talking about when they were opening a museum in Montgomery, Alabama, that was a museum as well as a monument to peace and justice, which has been called the Lynching Memorial. And he got a call from the Montgomery Advertiser, which is a newspaper there in town. And they were like kind of annoyed with him because he was giving an interview to the New York Times and not to his local paper. And he said, hey, so this is a memorial to the 4,000 plus victims of lynching across America. Have you ever gone back and looked at how you covered lynching in the 50s and 60s as a newspaper? And the editor was like, no, I have no idea. And he's like, why don't you go take a look at that and then call me back? And so on the day that the museum was unveiled, the headline of the Montgomery Advertiser on the front page was an apology for the way in which the paper had covered the history, well, not the history, the current events of lynching throughout that time period. And so I think Brian Stevenson, like standing up to that newspaper, was actually an act of hope. Like he wouldn't have said, go back and look at your history if he didn't have any hope that they might say, we're going to address this. I mean, he didn't know that was what was going to happen, but he also was, I think, in pushing back, he was operating out of a hopeful posture. So a story like that, like it really does, it gives me hope that we can use our heads, our hearts, and our hands to actually move towards hope and healing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, your mention of the museum makes me think of a subject near and dear to my heart, which is the connection between place and spirituality. And I also was very interested to see on the Head, Heart, and Hands guide that you have on your website that you include a suggested 3-day civil rights itinerary. I write a lot about spirituality and travel, and I have experienced many times the power of place to open a channel for spirit. So I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the places that have really formed your spiritual life in relation to these issues, but maybe in more general terms as well.
Yeah, so certainly for me, I grew up in a small southern town in North Carolina, and that was very formative. This was the late 70s and early 80s, so it was still a town that was pretty functionally segregated. And it was a place of great comfort and safety and security for me. and did give me, I think, a sense of belonging in the world. And yet when I grew up and looked back and recognized again that I was living amidst injustice in both a kind of personal and systemic way, just in terms of the way businesses and schools and doctors' offices were all operating, that was a real disjunction for me, both spiritually and personally, to be like, gosh, this place that was so idyllic for me as a child was built on really oppressive history that had only just begun to become undone, in very recent years. So that was a place that seemed really safe and good, and then later seemed really horrific in some ways. And I had to do a lot of work to try to, I don't know that reconcile is the right word, but to hold both of those realities and ask questions about them. Some of the other very specific places, as you mentioned, we did do a civil rights tour with our kids, and it is a different thing to stand on the streets of Montgomery, Alabama, than it is to read about them in the pages of a book, and to recognize the proximity of, monument to Jefferson Davis and the words of Martin Luther King. They're essentially next to each other on these streets. But what we also did as a family this past summer is we did a tour of some cities in New England, because that's where we're from. And I think it's really easy for New Englanders to say that bad racial things happened a long time ago and far away, rather than we are also people who historically and in the current moment have been caught up in systems of injustice. And so we went to Rhode Island, where the largest slaveholding family actually came out of Rhode Island. So we went to see their home and to learn that story. And again, it's just different to stand in the home and to, see the evidence of the wealth that came from being a family that was trading human lives, and to recognize what the temptations were there, and then to see, and that family married into this family, which is a Connecticut family, that, it just felt much more personal and close to home. And I think that's really important, that we do understand our national history, but also our much more local history. And there's a spiritual reality that comes with reckoning with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I remember being in the Battle of the Little Bighorn site in Montana. I think it's Montana or Wyoming. And just being, there really is no substitute to being at the place itself. To see the outline of the hills and the sweep of the sky. And their whole idea of pilgrimage, I think, is people, I think, sometimes define it too narrowly, it's just to churches or to built environments of one sort or another. But a lot of it is a pilgrimage of memory too, when we honor what happened there.
And there are, I think, I'm just thinking about, we also went to just New Haven, Connecticut this summer, and we walked through a historically Black neighborhood and then towards the campus of Yale University. And our daughter Marilee, again, was the one who said, why did the temperature just change? Because she could feel that it got literally cooler as we walked towards Yale, and it was because of the number of trees that were planted. And so we talked about the ways in which cities sometimes are designed to hold trees or not to hold trees. And just that we wouldn't have had, that physical experience for her of walking from one neighborhood to another and noticing that it was kind of uncomfortably hot and pleasantly cool, and we were not far away, was really a part of understanding the historical reality and to your point, just the memory and the landscape of this place.
Mm-hmm. 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 So what's next? What are you working on? What do you hope to work on?
That's a great question. So To Be Made Well is a book that I wrote that came out in March. So not quite a year ago. And I usually give myself about a year to percolate. And so I'm in that percolation stage where I'm still doing some speaking around this concept of To Be Made Well is all about personal, spiritual, and social healing. So some of these things we've been talking about here, how to we be made well, in ourselves and also in our communities. But as I look, and my husband also just got a big new job, so we're moving, and we'll be moving to a school. And so there's some questions for me as far as my own participation or not in said school. So I'm in a period of not quite waiting, but discerning how I want to move forward. I have about a couple books in mind that might all actually be the same book. That's often the case for me, that have to do with thinking about love and Down syndrome and the meritocracy. And what does it mean to walk in a way of blessing instead of a way of what I'm calling a way of payment. And I'm not sure how those ideas are all going to come together or whether they will, but those are the things I'm thinking about.
So when you do speaking, and it sounds like you do a lot of it, what topics do you generally talk about? And I mean, do you talk generally do you do workshops or, 1 or 2 hour sorts of things, or?
I do a whole range of speaking things, whether that's like I preach at our church, every couple of months, and that's 20 minutes and, kind of pick a passage from scripture and get to learn about it and share some stories. I just came from a women's retreat that was on the topic of the book To Be Made Well. So I gave 4 different, anywhere from 30, probably around 4 30-minute talks over the course of that weekend on these ideas of personal, spiritual, and social healing, how we can move towards healing in our personal lives as well as a society. And then I'm speaking in January at a conference related to theology and disability. So that will be more specific around topics of belonging. How do we make institutional spaces and programs accessible, not just to people with disabilities, but to a wider array of people? How do we have a posture of welcome? And then occasionally I'll be asked to just give a lecture, a one-off type of thing. But at that conference, I'll do both some keynote speeches as well as a workshop on accessibility.
So if people are listening to this, they can read your books and they can also look into booking you as a speaker at some kind of event, it sounds
Absolutely. I love it.
And listening to your podcast,
it's so fun.
too.
Yeah. Oh, they can listen to the podcast. So many ways to hear from me. But,
and you have a great newsletter too that I signed up for.
I do have a newsletter.
Yeah. So Beth, I'm wondering, are there other questions that have come up, or maybe you or Brian have some things you wanted to add? Or
I had a question. I was interested. I didn't know that you had what your major had been. You said African American Studies, and having grown up in an environment that wasn't that diverse, what led you to that major?
Well, in some ways it was the growing up I moved when I was 10, and when I lived in North Carolina, I was in a 50% Black, 50% white town. It was very divided in terms of the ways in which Black and white people were actually connected or communicating with one another. And then we moved to Greenwich, Connecticut, which was predominantly white. And I was told by many of my peers, essentially, and these are 10 and 11-year-olds, but essentially you came from that racist place and now you're in the enlightened land of the North. And I was like, but there are no brown or Black people here. So what are you talking about? Not oh, no, where I lived was so amazing on this point. But it was just I couldn't make sense of how people were interpreting their own experiences. And so when I went to high school, that was all still kind of in the back of my mind. I read Beloved, Toni Morrison's Beloved, in class, and it was just the most transformative book of my time in high school. And when I went to college, I actually was an English major and had an African American Studies minor. But what happened was I basically just took an African American literature class because of Beloved, because it was just I want to know more. And I thought, this is just the richest, deepest, most true writing I've read. I just loved it. And so I just kept taking those classes. It wasn't even an intentional thing. And by the time I'd gone through a couple of years, my advisor was like, you essentially are getting a minor in African American studies as long as you write some things for your thesis around this. And so I did, so it just I kind of backed my way into it, but I think I also was always really aware of being in these pretty homogenous spaces. And I think I was somewhat aware of not only the desire, books had always been a way to get out of those spaces and learn more, but I was also aware that, again, well, actually, have I mentioned this here? No, that I had a pretty severe eating disorder throughout high school and college. And I was definitely depressed. I didn't have those words for it at the time, but I think there was something in me that knew that the world of achievement and perfection that I was living and being commended for had real problems, spiritual problems, personal problems. And so I think there was a part of me that really was trying to find ways to get out. Even though it took a long time, again, it was not until the birth of our daughter that I really started to be able to articulate some of those things. But I do think that was all present for me, even at that time.
Wow, thank you. Also, I was really intrigued by part of your chapter 22 session where you stated that your pastor went out of her way to really transform the church. And I was wondering if you could, for those of us who may have not gotten to that chapter yet or forgot about it, can you talk about what she did and if there was any kind of response from because it seemed like it was really easy, but I can't imagine. I've heard of situations where pastors have been asked to leave because they've tried some similar things that your pastor did. But can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so we are a part of a denomination called the Evangelical Covenant Church, which is actually historically a Swedish denomination, but in the past 40 years has done a lot of work when it comes to racial justice and has become more of a multi-ethnic denomination, not just on the congregational level, but also in terms of leadership. That said, our church is almost 100% white in the country with an elderly population. And so our pastor, knowing kind of the wider body of our church is not represented in our church itself, also knowing that, there are these issues coming up in the news all the time and that we as Christians have, an invitation, at least an obligation, certainly, to respond, wanted to just consider how can we bring, especially some of the people who have been in their homogenous ways in Western Connecticut for a long time. And she started by just inviting a friend of hers, a fellow pastor who's a Black man, to come and preach and to come with his entire family. So not just to come individually, but to come as a family. And one of the things that he did, to his credit, and I don't think they talked about this ahead of time, but he stood up at the front of the room and every time he preached, he would say, "Hello, cousins. Like, we are family and I am here to bring my family to be with your family." We'd have a meal afterwards, and he is a great preacher. He's coming back. He's actually preaching for us the entire month of January. And she just regularly had him and then another woman who again was kind of going through the ordination process. So it was an opportunity for her to learn how to preach, but she was a chaplain at Rikers Island, Black woman who would come up and again, preach and then also come and spend time with us. And, our church, and I will say, no one preached on like controversial topics. I mean, it was very much like a biblical message of hope and truth. And, there was not, let me talk about the news. That was not happening. And probably there would have been a lot of resistance had that been the case. And then over time, another woman who is actually from a Native American background and grew up on a reservation in California, she came to our church first just as a member and then ended up as a pastoral intern because she was getting her own Master's of Divinity and worked for the church for a while. And so again, all of these were small steps towards a greater awareness and openness, I believe, to what God was doing outside of our little, homogenous church bubble. And yeah, I could go on because there really have been these, again, just things that our pastor has done that have been gentle, but within this context, they've also been pushing the edge, but really doing that with a willingness to listen. People have pushed back, but they've also come along, and there has been change, and change not just in like our I don't know, demographic makeup of our church, but more so in terms of, I think, the hearts and minds of people in the pews.
Okay. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions for Amy Julia?
I had a couple that are follow-ups to what Lori had asked earlier, Amy Julia, about future books. So first question is, have you ever thought about writing something on overcoming perfectionism?
Well, in some ways, the book I'm talking about would be, probably not directly about that, but that sense of being someone who has always, my instincts have been to like follow the meritocracy, what I call the meritocracy, like that sense of climb the ladder, achieve more, do it better. And really having Penny in my life has been part of the invitation to step off of that ladder and to pursue a different way. And then in some ways, A Good and Perfect Gift, it is not a story of overcoming perfectionism, but it is a story of like confronting perfectionism and recognizing that the biblical understanding of perfect is so different than the American understanding of perfect. So I think the American understanding of perfection is like conforming to an ideal, and the biblical understanding of perfection is being who you are meant to be. Like there's a sense of that wholeness and completion. So in some ways I've been writing about that, and perhaps this next book would really incorporate that. Although I never do a very good job of like, here are the 3 steps to overcome perfection, which I think people would really like. And
well, that's the thing, you haven't focused on. You dealt with it tangentially or as
right.
part of a broader story, which I think has been very helpful. But I just thought, since that keeps coming up for you,
no, it's a great point, and I think there's something to be said for that.
So the other thing is that that I'm such a big fan of White Picket Fences, and also the Head, Heart, Hands that you did as an accompaniment or follow on to that, which by the way was really generous of you to just give that away basically. But I'd love and maybe your new book that you're talking about fits into this category too, I don't know, but a follow on to that whole theme. I
know you desperately want that. You've asked me about this before.
I know. I'm going to keep asking you too.
Yeah. I think for me, the book I wrote, To Be Made Well, to me was a follow-up for White Picket Fences, in the sense that it is trying to say, okay, so the last line of White Picket Fences is, do we want to be made well? And then this book, To Be Made Well, is saying, okay, what would that look like? And it's kind of a sideways approach. It's not a direct, because I'm saying, first of all, when we're experiencing pain in our bodies, what do we do with that? And how do we understand Jesus as a healer in our bodies, our minds, and our spirits? But also saying that an integral part of a biblical understanding of healing is the community. And that means confronting injustice and participating in God's healing work in the world, and not just in our personal lives or even in our families. So I don't know if I have more. It's not like I don't have anything more to say, but I think the ways in which I'm doing that have been through podcast conversations, through giving talks, and through writing these individual chapters or something like Head, Heart, Hands. But I don't know if I have, and maybe this will come. Sometimes, it takes me like 10 years for all the stories to have come together for a book to take shape. Again, like that conversation I had with Marilee in the car today, I was like, oh my gosh, like that just came out of the blue, but we've been building towards it for years now. And what a gift, right? That we get to have that. And that she, is having her perspective shaped a little bit differently, because her mom came to understand some stuff, and her dad too, over the past 10 years. So who knows? Maybe there's more.
And then what about your podcast? Where is that heading? Are there particular types of guests that you're planning on for that?
Yeah, great question. I've been focused on the theme of healing, both social and spiritual, in the past, and personal, like in terms of even like physical healing, over the course of the past 6 months, because of this book. And that's led to some really cool conversations, both, whether that was like I talked to a psychotherapist about healing, but I also talked to a medical doctor, and I was able to have conversations about the disability and how do you think about healing and disability, as well as some that are more related to social divisions and justice. And I am at a point again of just asking that same question. Am I going to kind of, right now I say this is a podcast about personal and social healing. And am I going to keep doing that? Am I going to move towards something else? I don't know. I don't know the answer, but I'm always interested to see what comes next too.
Sounds good. Does anyone have any other questions? Okay.
Do we have time for
Yeah, we
one,
do have
one
time
more,
for-
one more
yep,
question? So
yep.
we've talked a lot about relations with individuals and about history, but one thing we haven't talked too much about is the church, a church with a capital C. And certainly, everyone agrees the church is in a time of great transition and a lot of stresses, a lot of, coming from the pandemic, as well as confronting longstanding issues relating to social justice. So what would be your message be to the church after all the work that you've done over many years relating to some of these issues?
So I guess I have great hope for the church, which means there is lament contained within my understanding of the church right now. But I really believe that the church has so many tools already available, like so many, whether that's the richness of the stories we have in our scripture, the spiritual practices that have been developed through different church traditions over so many years, whether that is the incredible diversity economically, demographically, socially, ethnically, racially, all of those things. We have so much that is available to us that could bring hope and healing to our personal lives, to our institutions, to our nation. I don't think we're realizing all of that. We're not coming close, but it's there. Whether that is, practices of like contemplative prayer to understand our own belovedness, or practices of bringing baked chickens or doing Bible, I think one of the things like in that little town that I grew up in, I won't tell the whole story, but over time, because of some violence in the town, some white Christians and Black Christians started praying together in different locations around the town. And on the one hand, you could say all that was a prayer group. But what has happened is, of course, friendship and conversation among friends and among Christian friends about what is going on within their communities. And so there's been conversation about school reform and about providing ways for people who've been in prison to come back into the community. And so I do believe that these simple practices of Bible study, of prayer, of sharing meals and fellowship together, of singing, of scripture, there's so much that we have already at our disposal. And certainly we need in the midst of that to name the harm and the injustice but we've got tools for that too. We know about repentance and confession in a way that I think our wider culture does not. That it is assumed that we have screwed it up in horrible ways. And there's a place for that to actually be reckoned with before the Lord. And it might be really painful and hard and messy, but we've got that. So I have great hope for the church that we might realize who we already are so that we can bring hope and healing for ourselves and for our world.
Beautifully said. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate all that you've shared, Amy, Julia, your insights, your chapter contribution, and we're just hoping that we can all move forward and heal our divides. Lori, thank you so much for moderating, and Brian, thank you so much for this book, for the opportunity to coordinate these sessions. It's been such a gift to meet all these wonderful people. And I'd just like to say that these conversations are on YouTube, and we mentioned it last month, and I think Lori touched on it, and Amy Julia's also said something about how we feel like this is such a huge task, but when we just reach out to the people in our families, I think we mentioned last month about the 6 feet away from us, people that we know and that we're familiar with. And maybe we've already had a contentious conversation, but all of these conversations are taped on YouTube. not only can you go back and watch this one, but you can watch all the ones we've had this year. Email these to people, copy the link, email it, and then let that be the beginning of another conversation, a less contentious conversation. So I'm just so grateful for this conversation, for the time, for the books, and for the whole year of great discussions. And tune in next Zoom time, same time, 12 o'clock noon, when the conversation will center around Betty Prize. And in January, this book will be front and center. And Brian, if you have anything to wrap us up with.
Yeah, Betty will be speaking on January 5th. That's the first Thursday in January. And Betty leads a consulting company called Credence and Company. So as you mentioned, Bethany, she was one of the contributors to book 2 in the How to Heal Our Divide series. And so you can take a look at that, or you can take a look at Credence and Company and learn more about Betty in advance of our conversation with her. So thanks you all. Really appreciate you all participating in this. Great to see you as always.
Thank you.
Thanks for having
Delighted
me.
to be involved.
Bye.
Yeah. Thanks, Amy Julia.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure. Thank you.